Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us here in the Fracking and Your Health. What you need to know about the health impacts of fracking on your personal health and surrounding communities. So we've got a great list of speakers lined up for you this evening. This is a collaborative event hosted by New Brunswick or NB Lung, your local lung health charity, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and the New Brunswick Anti-Shale Gas Alliance. So the speakers that we have with us this evening, our first speaker, Jim Emberger, is the spokesperson for the New Brunswick Anti-Shale Gas Alliance, an alliance of groups of all types from across the province that has for nearly 15 years followed the science concerning all aspects of unconventional gas, educated the public about it, and filed lawsuits to prevent its coming to New Brunswick. Welcome, Jim. Secondly, we have Melanie Langille, the president and CEO of NB Lung. With a background in environmental and human health risk assessment, she brings firsthand experience of the weaknesses in the regulatory framework related to the assessment of human health risks related to the industry. Welcome, Melanie. And our last speaker is Dr. Renee Turcotte, who is the founding president of the New Brunswick chapter of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, also known as CAPE NB. She practiced family medicine in New Brunswick for more than 30 years before retiring in 2019. She's been awarded the Canadian Medical Association's Honorary Member Award, which recognizes distinction in medicine. So I'll turn it over to Jim.
Okay. I'm Jim Emberger from NBASGA, which is shorthand for New Brunswick Anti-Shale Gas Alliance. We've had a moratorium on fracking for almost 10 years, and preceding that, it was a 4-year intense struggle to achieve that moratorium. Now we have one of our political parties calling for a lifting of that moratorium and the exploitation of shale gas. A recent newspaper poll found that nearly 20% of respondents didn't even know enough about the issue to offer an opinion. This is probably due to the fact that the moratorium has been very successful and it's removed the issue from public discussion, except for periodic hinting by the government that it would like to lift it. So it's important to know the history of the issue, why it was so contentious and such a big matter for the public, and most importantly, what we've learned about it in the last 10 years. The opposition to shale gas was a classic grassroots movement. Ordinary citizens learned that there was an extractive industry being promoted by government about which they knew next to nothing. And based on just what I said about the polling, unfortunately, we're sort of back to that in some respect, that there's now a large gap in what people actually know about this. So I've been asked here, sort of at the last second, to give you a thumbnail reminder of exactly what fracking is, as it's fundamental to all the things that you'll hear later on tonight about why we're in opposition to it. The sort of official name for it, we've shortened it to fracking, but it's actually high pressure, slick water, hydraulic fracturing of horizontal wells. And it's quite a mouthful. Fracking's a lot easier. But when you take that apart to see what exactly it is, if you start at the beginning, it's high pressure. That means that fluids, water essentially, but with other things in it, have to be put under extremely high pressure, which requires the use of a lot of generators and pumps in order to create enough pressure to fracture rock. And this means a lot of burning of fossil fuels just in the process of getting the gas out. The slick water refers to the fact that the water that's used in the process is augmented with a variety of chemicals. There's a list of close to 1,000 of them that they can be chose from. Every frac is different depending on what they need to do for that particular well. These things are largely unregulated. We know that about a third of them already we know are toxic or carcinogenic chemicals, and most of the rest of them we don't know anything about. The third part is the hydraulic fracturing, which I said is using water to actually crack open rock. and into very small fissures, which is held open by sand, which is also goes down into these wells to hold the cracks open and let the gas seep out. And then finally is the matter of horizontal wells. This means that unlike old mining or oil and gas exploration, where they essentially just drilled a hole vertically down into the ground into a pocket of existing oil or gas, what they do now is drill down into rock, which is not a pocket of gas, but is just rock that holds all this gas in it at basically the size of micro accumulations, and they have to shatter that open. And they do that by going horizontally through the rock rather than straight down. So these wells can be miles long, and as time goes on, they're getting longer and longer. So that's what fracking is. Okay, well, these groups, when they heard about all this, they began to talk to each other and to question government and industry, and several concerns arose that seemed pretty worrisome to them. Chief among them were two related issues that also seemed to have aroused opposition to shale gas in places that we heard about. The first was that the fracking process, because of these kilometer-long wells, used huge amounts of fresh water, which is taken forever out of the water cycle. And this water is then contaminated with, as I told you, a variety of chemicals, many known to be toxic or carcinogenic, and many with no information. As well, when the water came back up from the ground, along with opening up the gas, it brought with us heavy metals and radiation that were pumped up from the earth. Well, in our largely rural province, with most people getting their drinking water from wells and needing water for agricultural purposes, the twin threats of water usage and potential contamination of water supplies spread the movement widely and quickly. Then, with the presence of so many toxic substances in the air and water, naturally the second concern to arise was what was the threat to the health of those people living and working near the industry. At the time, fracking was a novel technology, which meant that there was very little research on its effects on health or the environment. But the little that was there, plus the anecdotal and frightening evidence that we gathered from people elsewhere who were living with fracking already, was a great cause for alarm and essentially is what caused the citizen uprising. I call it an uprising because all the following ensued. 1,500 people gathered at the legislature in a huge demonstration, probably the largest that New Brunswick has experienced. Petitions with 30,000 signatures were submitted to the government. Over 40 groups, including Anglophone, Francophone, and indigenous groups, united together in a broad alliance, something else that had hardly ever happened before in the history of the province. These groups include unions, religious groups, civic societies, environmental, public health groups, farmers, and ad hoc groups that got together and formed just to oppose shale gas. These groups conducted educational sessions across the province called the Voice of the People Tour, and things like I debated several industry spokespersons. People were exposed to the movie called Gasland, which may not mean anything to you now, but if you get a chance, it's probably out there on YouTube somewhere or on your streaming services. You might want to check out. It was a movie that changed a lot of people's lives. We brought in expert speakers from Canada, including David Suzuki, and from the US, who addressed people across the province about the water, climate, economic, and health issues of fracking. All this promoted more protests. Civil disobedience became a common occurrence. There were several blockades of exploration operations around the province. Our chief medical officer of health wrote an award-winning report, which was initially held back by the government until public pressure forced its release. Meanwhile, the author of a government pro-gas report was found to have faked his credentials. So this all was building over 4 years and finally came to a head just before a provincial election. Two events actually were there at the very end that pushed it sort of over the edge. First is NBASGA filed a lawsuit against the government based on a charter, excuse me, charter attack saying on that the fracking, I'm trying to get it right in my phrasing right, fracking interfered with the security of the person, which is one of our charter rights. And then there was a huge RCMP raid, violent raid on a peaceful indigenous protest camp, which brought the issue to global attention, really. Well, the ensuing election booted out the government. The new government brought together a nonpartisan committee and took testimony across the board from everybody. And the results of their decisions led to the government declaring this indefinite moratorium that was subject to several conditions being met before it could ever be lifted. One of those conditions stated that it must be scientifically proving that fracking could be done safely. Another one said that there must be a social license. And a third said that indigenous groups must be consulted. Well, the moratorium, while it stopped the production of gas, didn't end citizen engagement. Although many people were able to declare victory and let the issue go, and rightly so, it was exhausting for 4 years. The manner in which the moratorium was written made it vulnerable to being lifted by subsequent governments. So the three groups that are represented here tonight continue to keep up with the research over the last 10 years, along with other groups. And the research is poured in the form of thousands of scientific and health studies, government reports, media investigations, and lived experiences. The vast majority of this research confirms that the threats that we always suspected of shale gas were and are real. And besides the air, water, and health concerns already mentioned, which we'll hear about in more detail tonight, we learned that there were a lot of other downsides. Thousands of truck trips for each well pad, destroyed rural roads and bridges, costing billions of dollars to repair in other jurisdictions. Increases in accidents and fatalities from road and truck accidents became common. Forests were fragmented by wells, roads, pipelines, parking pads, to the detriment of wildlife, forest integrity, wetlands, and streams, and affecting tourism and agriculture. Rural communities were impacted by classic boom and bust industry ills, like increased cost of living, the expense and shortage of housing, stress on government services, particularly healthcare, and increases in crime and drug abuse. And finally, at the end, taxpayers are often left with enormous bills to deal with abandoned gas wells after the companies leave. This is an issue that's actually in current events right now out in Alberta, as they have thousands and thousands of wells that need to be closed up and they don't have the money to do it. So, and finally, the only process of disposing of the millions of gallons of contaminated wastewater containing all these chemicals I told you about has not changed one iota since our original concerns back 10 years ago. The way that almost all of it is disposed of is just by pumping it underground in pressurized wells and hoping that it stays there forever. Unfortunately, this has been found to be the cause of earthquakes in almost all the places where this occurs. And we've actually found that fracking itself, as these fracks get larger and larger, also cause earthquakes. This is again happening out in Alberta and British Columbia. And as it turns out, each one of these ills that I have mentioned also has a connection in one way or another, indirectly or directly, to public health and the healthcare system. And now, overarching everything, it turns out that the methane, which is natural gas, they don't like to call it methane because that sounds bad, so we say natural gas, but they're the same thing essentially, and that the leaks of methane from the entire industry, from the moment it's pulled out of the ground to the time it's burned in your kitchen stove, leaks to the atmosphere in a fair, large volume. And the problem is that when it leaks into the atmosphere without being burnt, it's 86 times more potent than the carbon dioxide that you get from burning coal and warms the planet that much more, 86 times over the first 20 years it's in the atmosphere. So as anyone with any knowledge of the news of the world can see, climate change is becoming a direct threat as we watch the hurricane hit Florida this evening, no matter where one lives. The Supreme Court of Canada has deemed it an existential threat. But most people aren't aware of the knowledge gained by the science and health community these last 10 years on the threats posed by fracking. These studies tend to appear in professional journals and are only rarely covered by mainstream media. So this brings us all to our next speakers, who are professionals who have tracked this vital knowledge on behalf of all of us. And so I'll leave you to them with this parting thought, is that virtually all the knowledge that we've gained in the last 10 years supports keeping our moratorium and actually changing it to a permanent ban. The threats to public health that we're going to talk about tonight are a case in point. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'll bring on our next speakers.
Awesome. Thanks, Jim. Very informative as always. Melanie, getting your slides up?
Yeah.
Great.
So like was introduced earlier, we are NB Lung. We are a lung health charity based in New Brunswick. We provide for essential patient supports, advocacy, and public education to protect the air we breathe. We've been doing this since 1933. There's been a variety of lung health threats over that time, as you can imagine. Air quality and climate change have come to the fore over the last 20 or so years as a very important lung health concern. I did have a bit of an introduction to myself. I did spend over a decade working in environmental consulting and looking at the impacts of our industry on our province. And I did find an awful lot of weaknesses in those systems. And so I've brought that now over into the nonprofit sector and representing those that are most vulnerable to the impacts of air pollution onto a number of technical working groups at the provincial and federal level as well. So for those that aren't, deeply and intimately acquainted with your lungs, our lungs look a little bit like this. We've got over 2,400 kilometers of airways and 300 to 500 million alveoli, and that's where the gas exchange happens, that vital gas exchange to keep your body going. And we take about 22,000 breaths every day. And at NB Lung, every single one of those breaths is very important to us. The tissues of our lungs are actually very delicate. They're easily damaged. And so they're very vulnerable to the air pollution. So there's the inside of your body that's literally in contact with the world around you 22,000 times a day. Exposure to air pollution can cause increases in mucus and difficulty breathing, inflammation of that delicate tissue, scarring can cause exacerbations of existing symptoms or worsening of existing symptoms for those that live with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, or asthma, which is very prevalent in our province, and other such diseases. In fact, 1 in 5 New Brunswickers lives with a lung disease. So for those of you on the call tonight, either yourself or someone you know or love, someone in your family is probably living with a lung disease right now. COPD exacerbations, so that's an increase, a flare-up of the symptoms of that chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, is the second cause of hospital admissions in our province, second only to childbirth. So it's a significant strain on our healthcare system to have exacerbations of this chronic condition. Also, lung cancer is the leading cause of avoidable mortality in New Brunswick. So when we look at the root causes of these exacerbations of symptoms and worsening of lung health conditions, air quality comes up time and time again. And in fact, the World Health Organization has indicated that air pollution is the biggest environmental risk to human health. So exposure to air pollution has different impacts. Both in the short term, you might find some throat irritation, shortness of breath, and in the long term can lead to development or worsening of asthma symptoms, bronchitis, that chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, like I mentioned, heart disease and hypertension as well. There's a slew of other non-lung diseases that come from air quality issues as well that I won't get into. But I wanted to just sort of frame that up, and then we're talking tonight about extracting, refining, and burning fossil fuels. And what does that look like from an air pollution perspective and a climate change perspective? So this is a graphic from the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, the State of the Air report. This is a really excellent user-friendly website if you're interested in what is in the air across Canada. So this is just a swath of, again, across Canada. 2019 is the most recent data set. But I wanted to bring your attention to the yellow color in these rings is the contribution from the oil and gas industry lumped as a whole there. And we also need to be mindful of that's just the industry, and it doesn't include the downstream uses of it. So the using it in your stove, the using it to heat your home, burning in our cars and things like that. So it's a significant chunk of these pollutants that are listed here, again, might not be important in your world, but these are the main ones that we look at from a health risk, from an air quality health risk perspective. This graphic here is about the various points during unconventional oil and gas extraction where we have hazardous air pollutants. So that's a lot to read on the slide, but just take in at the 10,000 foot level. The list is long, and those hazardous air pollutants are released at a number of stages across the exploration, the drilling, the well stimulation and completion. That's the actual fracks that happen, and wells can be fracked multiple times over their lifetimes. And then also the production, the processing, the transporting, and storage and impoundments during that life cycle. We also need to think sort of add to that. I wasn't able to add to this graphic, but then the downstream uses, where people are using a natural gas or methane in their day-to-day life. Our climate is changing, and that change is reducing air quality. This is a graphic from Health of Canadians in a Changing Climate. This changingclimate.ca, also a really excellent resource. It crosses the conventional silos of a number of federal government departments. There's Health Canada, there's Environment and Climate Change Canada, Natural Resources Canada, that have each spearheaded various chapters of what climate change is doing to us as Canadians. So this particular graphic has to do with the health effects of reduced air quality. So we see increase in incidence and severity of respiratory diseases, increase in hospital visits, increases in lung cancer, exacerbation of lung and heart conditions, allergic rhinitis and asthma. That's a little bit, peel apart that onion a little bit, but we know that with our changing climate, our growing season is longer. So those of us that deal with seasonal allergies may notice that these are starting earlier and earlier in the year, and lasting further into the fall. If you're anything like me, you've got a box of Kleenex at all times. Premature death is obviously a very big concern, and cardiovascular disease. And these can all be linked back to decreases in air quality. When we think about New Brunswick and who's at risk of air quality impacts of fracking right here in our province, well, we know that those that are working in the industry are heavily exposed to this type of pollution. So are the communities that are near the frack sites. And like Jim said, those wells can be kilometers long in the horizontal. So there can be methane leaking out, in a very large footprint beyond just the well pad itself. There's also the communities between the frack site and market. We're transporting this methane. It's leaking at every stage of the game, and it's contributing to climate change and pollution at all steps. And then the communities where the end product is eventually used and burned. From an air quality perspective, though, the most vulnerable to the health impacts of air quality are children, seniors, and those with chronic health conditions. And again, peeling that back a little bit, our province has a very high proportion of seniors living here. And we also have an awful lot of folks that are living with chronic diseases. Almost 70% of New Brunswickers are living with a chronic disease, so they are especially vulnerable to the impacts of air pollution. And I'd be remiss to do this talk without a little chat about the EIA regulation in New Brunswick. We could do a deep dive on this, but that's another talk altogether. But the environmental impact assessment regulation under the Clean Environment Act in New Brunswick was brought into place in 1987. And it's not seen very much updating to reflect modern science since that time. It's not aligned with the Federal Impact Assessment Act. It's very limited in scope, and our Auditor General has found that decision-making, transparency in that decision-making is lacking. And we don't even include in that assessment of what is acceptable risk. We don't even include a health impact assessment that is not diving into the determinants of health that include our environment and our social safety nets. So again, that we could talk about that a lot more, but suffice it to say, when a proposed industry comes into the province and wants to do work, they have to go through this EIA process, and it's either a green light or a red light. But we have an awfully non-rigorous system of green lighting development projects. So to top it all off, the take-home notes is fossil fuel extraction and use causes harmful air pollution and contributes to climate change. Now, there's no safe level of air pollution, and I guess I forgot this in one of the earlier slides, but Health Canada indicates that we have over 15,000 Canadians each year dying prematurely from air quality and air pollution, and a number of hospital admissions, exacerbations of existing lung conditions, etc. And it's undeniable that our climate is changing, and those changes are reducing the air quality. And New Brunswickers as a whole, we're vulnerable to that air pollution. But this quote really sums it up. This is pulled right out of the most recent Lancet document on climate change. And it's kind of a mouthful, but I am going to read it out because I thought it was very poignant. So the chair of the Lancet Countdown Report, and Lancet is a widely recognized medical journal. He says, while ambition to unlock money for adaptation will be critical, health-centered action requires urgent mitigation. This will require defending people's health from the interests of fossil fuel and other health-harming industries. Transformative climate action is needed today to enable a future where present and future generations can thrive. And I thought that so hit the nail on the head in terms of NB Lung's position on extraction and use of fossil fuels in our province. There's my contact info there. Thank you so much for your attention and joining us here this evening. I will pass the mic over to Dr. Turcotte.
Thanks a lot, Melanie. So just for you to know, I'm the CAPE chairperson for New Brunswick. CAPE is the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. And CAPE is working to better human health by protecting the planet. CAPE collaborates with other organizations nationally and internationally to work effectively and build power together. Okay, so we'll talk about fracking and our health. Next slide, please. So there is a lot of danger that comes with fracking, like you heard from Melanie and from Jim. The danger can come from the water well that is contaminated by the fracking. The toxin from natural gas can migrate into the drinking water aquifer from the fracking process and through unintended cracks in the gas well casing. Also, it can come from the burning, the flaring, the torching also. It's very polluting. And we'll see other causes of other danger from fracking. Next slide, please. We'll skip that one. So I divided it in steps. So establishing a well, what are the danger, the problem that are caused when they establish the well? Like Jim said, they have to build bridges, they destroy the land around, so it brings a lot of dust, a lot of noise from the trucks and machinery, light pollution, day and night light, so it perturbs the sleep. It can cause sleep disorder caused by the noise and the light. And with that come a lot of stress and anxiety and even depression. And also we can see a lot of pollution by diesel and diesel pollution by little particle matters, like Melanie said. Also, the damage to the lung and cancer can be caused by the silicium that is in the sand. And like Jim said, bridge and road damages. Next slide, please. So during the drilling phase and exploitation, there is still a lot of noise and dust because of the circulation, water shortage, because like Jim said, they use a huge amount of water. Groundwater contamination, because when they drill and they send the water and the sand and the toxic chemical in the well. There is, like Jim said, 1,000 unknown chemical, as well as at least 14 that are known to be toxic and are used in the fracking fluid. So if they said that 1 to 2% of the fracking fluid is composed by these toxicants, and they use 10 to 20 million of liters, that means 100,000 to 400,000 liters of chemical toxicant. And in the USA, they use 70 to 140 billion of gallon of water in their for 35,000 wells in the US every year. So that means 0.7 to 1.4 billion of liters of toxicant. And also there is the contamination of air, soil, indoor houses, like we said before, through spill, evaporation, or wastewater leakage, or flaring, like I said. And also exposition to radioactive material, because when they fissure that subsoil or underground, there is radioactive material that can come up. And we know that the New Brunswick soil contains a lot of radon, and radon can cause lung cancer. Next slide, please. When they close the well, like Jim said, there is many wells that are not closed and they're still leaking methane and other polluting chemical. And they found in the review of the 50 studies that they did in the spring, they found that there was higher level of fracking toxicant in the urine, the hair, the home tap water, and air of pregnant people in northern BC, especially First Nation, because those are the ones that are closer to the well. Next slide, please. So these toxic pollutants, Jim talked a little bit about them. They're made from organic hydrocarbon chemical like BTEX, benzene, toluene, ethyl benzene, and xylene. So they're known to cause cancer in humans. Benzene can cause aplastic anemia and acute myelogenous leukemia. All can cause neurological impairment. They can cause respiratory damages like chronic asthma, like Melanie told us, immunological system damages, which make us proner to infection or developing cancer or other illnesses, loss of appetite, fatigue, confusion, weakness, eye, skin, and mucous membranes irritation. Xylene may damage the liver and the kidneys. And there is other toxic pollutant, formaldehyde, NOx, hydrogen sulfide, and even ozone, which is a pollutant when it is in the ground, like the smog. There is also the small particle matters that are very small, like 2.5 micron. They can go into through our respiratory and our lungs. They go into our circulation system. They can plug our arteries. They go into our organs and do damages. The bigger ones that are still very small, PM10, they cannot stain the mucosa. And to give you a good comparison, a hair width is about 17 micron to 181 micron. So if you think that your hair is very thin, imagine these little particles that are very toxic. Next page, next slide, please. So these toxic pollutants in the chemicals for which toxicological data were available in the review of the 50 studies, 43% were known potential reproductive toxicant and 40 were known developmental toxicant. Other can induce inflammation and or disrupt hormonal activity in humans. Next slide, please. So living close by a well is very costly. Like we talk about asthma, asthmatic living close to fracking operation can see an increase in their asthma, an exacerbation in their asthma. And the study found that there was an increase in asthma inhaler prescription, which are very expensive. Some can cost more than $100, and many people will need them at least once a month. And they found that there was an increase in emergency visit and an increase in hospitalization. And a study in 2016 in US found an increased rate of childhood asthma, 2,200 new cases, and also death associated, 7,500 deaths, with a cost of 77 billion in total impact due to air pollution. They saw also an increased rate of other respiratory diseases. Next slide, please. So it can also affect the cardiovascular system, like we saw with Melanie. They found that there was an increase in incidence of cardiac illnesses, and particularly an increase in hospitalization for heart failure and heart failure patients, especially the older patient. Heart failure is when your heart cannot pump anymore and you start to become swollen and to have more difficulty to breathe, and you can die from that. So they found that there was a high mortality risk, and there was also a decrease in life expectancy. Next slide, please. So they found also an increase in incidence of cancer. Like one study showed that children have 2 to 3 times the odds of developing acute lymphoblastic leukemia. So that was a control study in Pennsylvania from 2009 to 2017. Next slide, please. It impacts also our genitourinary system. They found that there was more urinary tract infection, more kidney infection, more kidney stone, which are can be very painful, all of these problems. And there was an increase in hospitalization, for sure, an increase in medication, etc. Next slide, please. So in the pregnancy and fracking, these are a very, very sad impact from fracking. On the review of these 50 studies, among which 2 were done in Canada, 1 in BC and 1 in Alberta, on the effect of fracking on the health of the population living close to the industry, half of the studies focused on pregnant people and their newborns. And they found there was a significantly increased risk of spontaneous preterm birth between 20 and 31 weeks. Imagine losing your baby around 20 to 31 weeks. All the emotional distress, all the sadness and from the mother, the father, and the grandparents, and even the little brother and sister. What can you tell them? There won't be any baby coming out of the mommy's body or coming out of the hospital. And we know that babies usually they survive around 24 weeks. That's the time where they have a best chance of survival. And they are preterm infant, and the mean cost of a preterm infant is 9 times the time of a baby born at term. So it brings a lot of emotional distress and financial distress to the family when the baby survives also, and a lot of problem. Many preterm babies can have a lot of difficulties, and not just around birth, but during all the infancy and even their adulthood. So they found also an increase in small for gestational age at birth, increased risk of congenital heart defect like higher pulmonary artery and valve defect, aortic artery and valve defect, conotruncal defect, and tricuspid valve defect. All of these are very, very painful for the baby, need a lot of surgeries and very costly. A lot of problem for the family too. So higher odds also of neural tube defect, limb reduction defect, spina bifida. So imagine your baby having all these problems. Next slide, please. So in summary, Living close to the hydraulic fracking industry exposes people and their children and future babies to numerous adverse health outcomes. It is very costly emotionally, physically, psychologically, spiritually, and economically for people surrounding this area of fracking. It will pose a great stress on our health system already on the brink of the abyss if we start again on that fracking down track. First Nation and people living in rural areas are more at risk than any other. It brings social and racial injustice. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Merci. Walaline Waliwan. In the next slide, you can see my references, but we can, it will be recorded, so you'll have access. Next slide. And next slide, please. Thank you. I will pass the micro to Angela.
That's great. Thank you. And thanks to all of our speakers. Wow. I thought I knew a lot about fracking before this evening, but it was really great to hear more about the health side of the industry. So thanks, Melanie and Renee and Jim, for sharing your expertise. NB Lung does want to remind everyone that advocacy is a big part of their work. So you can sign a petition right now on their advocacy page, download pre-written letters, and choose your priorities for the health of New Brunswickers to share with your MLA. Oh, Renee?
Yeah, if I may say to people, ask your candidate what they intend to do with climate change, what they intend to do now, to act now, because later is too late. So like the Seniors for Action now says, later is too late. So ask them what they intend to do and what they think about what a ban on fracking, what they think about that. Total ban, permanent ban on fracking. Thank you.
That's what we're looking for. Yep. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening. Take care.
Good night.